An increasing number of reports of
serious attacks on
people who are literally being
eaten alive.
So I was listening to podcasts as part of my daily news diet a few weeks ago, and something kind of unusual happened.
The BBC actually took a position on something.
In its latest attempt to banish a female presence from all spheres of public life, the Taliban has barred Afghan women from working for the United Nations.
Okay, I'm not saying this never happens, but it's definitely rare. This is really loaded language for a company that has some of the strictest neutrality standards in the business. I mean, this is the kind of language you would expect to hear from activists describing conservative efforts to limit trans rights.
Transgenderism must be eradicated from public life entirely.
You thought I was just referring to pro-trans activists, right? Well, conservative activists also use this kind of language to describe their own efforts.
Anyway, the BBC isn't an activist publication. They would never phrase things this way on US or European politics, so why the loaded language when it comes to Afghanistan? Are they biased against the Taliban? Well, I would argue, yes, they're biased all the time on every issue. Because all media is biased. Because the idea of unbiased news is a delusion.
Yeah, I know I'm on, but I don't care. I don't read the news until I get my Danish.
I wish I had a penny for every time someone told me you should create a media company that gives a quick rundown of the important stories of the day in an unbiased way. I could probably have paid for this fancy coffee with all those pennies, which isn't much, but still would be nice. And in case you're wondering, yes, I wrote this joke in so I could justify this as a business expense. I think we all understand bias as being the subjective decisions a journalist makes based on their views. But to be more precise, it could be defined as an inclination or prejudice for or against someone or something. And it sounds fine to say the news shouldn't have that, but telling a journalist to just be unbiased is like telling a Formula One driver to just drive faster. It demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of the job. So let's go over some of the basics. Let's imagine you're a journalist working for a newspaper and you walk into your newsroom. First thing in the morning is an editorial meeting. You and a few other journalists sit around a table and brainstorm ideas the paper should cover. Maybe there was a big bank robbery, or a firefighter saved a cat stuck in a tree. There's this viral video of a seal slapping a kayaker in the face with an octopus. I don't know, it could be anything. Maybe an elected official said something crazy on Facebook about Jewish space lasers starting wildfires. Most days, there's more news than you're able to cover as a publication. So there's a number of conversations happening simultaneously to narrow the selection down to a manageable number of stories. Like, what is important for the community to know? This is often referred to as the public interest test. Not is the public interested, but is it in the interest of the public to know this? Ideally, you want this question to be a top priority. But if you're TMZ, is the public interested is also a top priority. So number two, obviously, what gets clicks or sells paper if you're a newspaper, or gets views if you're a TV channel or a YouTube-based business. But it can also be, will covering the stories potentially make our advertisers or owners unhappy? Also, how expensive will this story be to cover? Do we have to send a team somewhere? Is it a dangerous area that might require special considerations like insurance or body armor or security contractors? Or maybe the footage is copyrighted and we need to pay a licensing fee. All of these put together can be summed up as what is profitable for the company. There might, aside from that, be legal considerations like exposure to slap suits. Watch John Oliver's video on that. Or what are we allowed to show?
Jesus, is there a dead baby inside of there?
No, for Christ's sake, are we breaking the law by showing this?
Another important question, does the story fit our format? If it's a really visual story, you can't really cover it on the radio. If it's too complicated, you can't cover it in a 60-second YouTube short. Hi. Okay, you're out of frame now. Okay. And oftentimes financial or economic stories that would be really important to cover don't make it to TV because it's hard to make them visually appealing. There's only so many times you can show random numbers on a screen or the Wall Street Bull to illustrate a finance story.
In economic news today,
click. I just switched over to a Seinfeld rerun.
These are just some of the questions to take into consideration. So when I hear, and I hear this often, people say the media doesn't talk about what really matters, I ask, okay, what should the media be talking about? And I get a different answer every single time. Your answer might be right, but someone else might have another right answer too, and at the end of the day, you have to make decisions. By this point, I'm sure a lot of you have been pulling your hair out screaming, Chomsky and manufacturing consent at the screen, and I can hear you all the way from here. If you haven't read this book, you 100% should. In short, it's about how market incentives and self-censorship turn the mass media into tools of propaganda even without government coercion. It's brilliant, and no discussion of the media can ever be complete without mentioning it. But my point is, even the naive, idealized version of the media is already biased and inherently imperfect before you even get to the criticisms in this book. I mean, what I'm talking about applies to everyone down to even small YouTubers who don't have the conflicts of interest of large media conglomerates. So I specifically avoided Chomsky tangents because this video is long enough as it is, and that's a whole other conversation for another day. So to circle back, the Jewish space laser post by US Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. It's a Facebook post, so it's hard to make it visually appealing, but does it pass the public interest test? I mean, she's crazy, and the quote is obviously ridiculous, so there's an argument to be made it doesn't deserve any attention because she wouldn't get any if she weren't a politician. But at the same time, she was elected to federal office, and it's important to know what kind of people are representing you. I'm inclined towards, you might say I'm biased towards the latter perspective, but I don't think the former is completely wrong. None of these considerations have just one right answer, so the decisions will be based on your biases both as an individual and as an institution. And by institutional bias, I don't just mean which side of the political spectrum your media company leans towards. The type of readership or audience you have will influence your public interest test.
For example, one of my first jobs as a journalist was at a small local English-language newspaper in Nice, in the south of France. We'd cover the same local politics as local French papers, but when election time came in the US, we'd run stories on how to register to vote as a US citizen living abroad, and we'd interview organizations that would help people with that. This wasn't a story covered by any local French paper because it just didn't affect their readership.
And if your audience skews older or younger, or if you have mostly black readers or women, they're affected differently by different issues, which will bias the selection of your stories. So before the first word, objective or not, makes it out of your mouth or onto your notepad, you've already stacked bias upon bias. Public interest test, business and legal considerations, production issues. This might seem innocuous to you. Maybe you're thinking, but this is not the kind of bias I want to talk about. I want to talk about the political bias of how a story is actually covered. And we'll get there. But the selection of your stories is incredibly important. Just watch the 2014 film Nightcrawler with Jake Gyllenhaal. Even without getting into the main character's methods for how he gets his footage, the instructions he gets from the news producer are a perfect example of a really messed up selection bias. And her bias is based on business considerations.
We find our viewers are more interested in urban crime creeping into the suburbs.
Obviously, not all news producers or editors are like that, but maybe there's something to be said about competition among news companies and how the most responsible journalism isn't always the most successful from a business perspective. I think this is a good point to segue into something I need to talk about before we continue with the rest of the video. This isn't a sponsor break. I'm not anywhere near there yet. I just wanted to say that if you saw my last video and you want more on the ground political reporting and analysis, I got you. I got plenty of that planned for this channel, but that's expensive, speaking of business considerations. There was just an election in Spain a few days ago. There are massive wildfires in Southern Europe. I would love to have gone there and go to election rallies and speak to Spanish voters, or cover the firefighting efforts and talk to people affected by the wildfires for a video about how climate change is affecting Europe. And if you want to see those kinds of videos, and if you want to help me make them, the best way you can do that is by supporting me on Patreon. For as little as €3 a month, you can help me fund the kind of in-depth, high-quality, on-the-field reporting I'm trying to make here. And look, I don't want anyone to give me money if you're struggling to make ends meet. So if you can't afford a monthly subscription, you can still support this channel by subscribing, ringing the bell, leaving a like and comment, and sending this video to your friends. And if you can do that, that would really help. So thank you, and now back to the video. So you made it out of the editorial meeting. You stopped by the coffee machine on the way to your desk so you can work on the stories you were assigned. And I'm not going to go through years of journalism school curriculums on how to report and write a story, but it's a time-consuming process that takes years of experience to get good at. In some publications, every article can go through like 8 people, from the reporter who wrote the story to the copy editor who will check the grammar and the writing, up through a chain of fact-checkers and editors of various levels of seniority who will each weigh in on whether a story needs more reporting or if it can be published as is.
But we got to go with this now. No, I'm not going to rush the story, Mike.
But a process that extensive is increasingly rare. Not every media company has time for it, and for breaking news, you might just need to put something out within 5 minutes of first hearing about it, even if all the facts haven't come in yet. And that notion of all the facts coming in, you just never know when that's the case. There might always be something new happening. My point is, it's a lot of work, takes a lot of time. So when people say, well, I don't need the press anymore, I can just do my own research. Well, No, you can't. Presumably, you're busy doing your own job. There's a reason why journalism is a full-time job. When you're subscribing to a publication, you essentially pay people to spend their days doing the research you don't have time to do, in addition to going out in the field, talking to sources, and doing everything else involved. So that at the end of the day, you can read an article or listen to a podcast or watch a video that will, in 10 minutes, give you information that might have taken days or even weeks to gather. And to distill days' worth of information into a consumable piece of media, choices have to be made. Shortcuts and simplifications, omissions even. Hopefully not important ones, but the shorter the format, the more biased it will have to be. If I had to summarize the Nahel riots in France last month into a 60-second YouTube short or TikTok video, I could say it was because a 17-year-old got killed by police, or police brutality and racism in general, or systemic racism, children from an immigrant background tired of being an underclass. I could say it's a direct result of immigration itself. This is the least informed take you can have, but a lot of people have it nonetheless. I could say it's about immigration policies, bad choices the government made in integrating families 2 or 3 generations back, or the lack of investment in low-income neighborhoods. Some might say it's a lack of investment in policing, or failure by parents to prevent their children from going out to riot. There's so many angles I could talk about here. If I just spout all of those, I'm not really explaining anything. I'm just telling you, here are all the things you can Google, figure it out yourself. So when I'm picking one to explain in the time that I have, I'm being biased. I just have to decide as a journalist which one is more important than the others.
And if you find an angle to sensationalize the story by saying something like, and it's actually way weirder than you think, you're good to go.
Obviously, if I have more than 60 seconds, I can be way more nuanced, but even then, there's never enough time to say everything there is to say about a story. Whether you have a 10-hour docuseries or a 10-minute video, you have to make choices. So every journalist has heard someone say, but why didn't you mention this thing that I really care about? Oftentimes, it's because this thing just didn't serve the story. Is it biased not to mention it? Yeah, all of these decisions involve bias, but they're still not the bias you want to talk about, so let's get into it.
This idea of the objective, unbiased journalist hasn't always been around. Newspapers used to be owned and financed by political parties. Then in the 1900s, after the invention of the radio and the creation of the FCC, the US government tried to essentially criminalize bias with regulations like the Fairness Doctrine, which mandated media companies must give a fair presentation of contrasting viewpoints. But the Reagan administration dismantled these regulations after they were used by Democratic presidents to censor the press, paving the way for today's hyperpartisan media. For a while, though, they enforced this platonic ideal of what was seen as unbiased journalism.
I'm not going to deny that media companies nowadays have political biases, but oftentimes the bias itself isn't the problem. A journalist or media company can have an inclination or prejudice one way or the other and be open about it, but still give you an accurate reporting of the facts. The problem is when, because of their bias, they mislead you, playing fast and loose with the facts, or lying by omission, or taking shortcuts that actually make a material difference in how a story is understood because it better suits their narrative. So bias isn't necessarily a problem, but too much bias absolutely can be. So you might ask, in terms of coverage, wouldn't it just be better not to be biased at all? Which brings me to this chart. You might have seen similar ones. There's a whole host of websites that place media companies on various sliding scales. This chart by Ad Fontes Media has 2 axes: partisanship on the x-axis and factuality on the y-axis. And I'm not going to say it's necessarily bad, but it's highly incomplete, it's oversimplified, it's kind of misleading in its omissions. In other words, it's kind of really biased. It only charts bias towards the left or the right of the political spectrum. It completely ignores all other political biases that you might not even realize are political, like pro or anti-establishment bias, or pro or anti-corporate, or seniority or stability bias, if you will. In other words, being open or closed to something new, like an up-and-coming politician versus someone who's been in office for 50 years or a brand new party. But even if you disregard all of those, this kind of chart makes it seem like you're only biased if you're on the left or the right. If you're in the middle, that is unbiased. That is the peak of the mountain of factuality. And that is the most insidious bias of them all, the one that denies its own existence. This is what the HBO show The Newsroom calls bias towards fairness.
How can you be biased toward fairness?
Bias toward fairness means that if the entire Congressional Republican caucus were to walk into the House and propose a resolution stating that the Earth was flat, the Times would lead with Democrats and Republicans can't agree on shape of Earth.
I prefer the term bias towards neutrality. So I heard this joke about 10 years ago by a former BBC war correspondent explaining why he left the company, and it went something like this.
A BBC reporter walks into a bar and sees 2 guys fighting. "What's happening?" he asks the bartender, who tells him, "Well, that guy says 2 + 2 = 4, and that guy says 2 + 2 = 5. Now, the position of the BBC is that the truth is somewhere in the middle. And look, the BBC is one of the most famous examples of bias towards neutrality, but it's almost an industry standard. It's often presented as the ideal to strive for.
Spotlight?
There's a tiny detail I love in the movie Spotlight that's a perfect illustration of this. When several editors are proofreading an article together, and then Boston Globe editor-in-chief Marty Baron circles an adjective on the page to have it removed.
What? Another adjective.
Because you don't want an adjective in your writing that implies you're putting a value judgment on something. Well, I would argue bias towards neutrality is no better than being biased towards the left or the right, and you can be just as misleading when you're being neutral. For example, a neutral position on the war in Ukraine is essentially a pro-Russia position. Should you be neutral on climate change stories and act as if both sides are equally right? What about flat Earth, or cigarettes causing cancer, or the 2020 US presidential election? Should you grant neo-Nazis the same deference as you do other political movements? Versions of these questions are asked every day in every newsroom on Earth, and prioritizing your neutrality, forcing yourself to be falsely balanced when the story isn't actually 50-50 is oftentimes a disservice to your audience and can leave you fundamentally unequipped to deal with some issues. Meet Alejandro Biondini. He's an Argentine politician who founded the New Triumph Party, and I can say they're a neo-Nazi party without any fear of a defamation lawsuit because they were dissolved by the Supreme Court for being openly neo-Nazi. Seriously, if you search this guy's name on Google Images, just looking at the results page for 5 seconds will thoroughly convince you he's a Nazi. These aren't photoshopped. So Biondini went back to the drawing board and created the Federal Patriotic Front, which presents itself as a standard ultra-conservative right-wing party. But now they reject the neo-Nazi label, and they're perfectly allowed to take part in elections. As journalists, should we take him at his word that he had a genuine change of heart on his Nazi views? I'm familiar with this example because I wrote about one of the most recent elections he took part in when I was working for an exceedingly neutral news agency. And I was not allowed to use the term neo-Nazi in my coverage because that would not have been balanced, and neutral reporting dictates that you must assume good faith on everyone unless proven otherwise. Like when CNN's Don Lemon asked Donald Trump, "Are you racist?" and when he said no, they acted like that settled the matter.
Are you racist?
I am the least racist person that you have ever met.
This assumption of good faith can be really damaging when it's often weaponized by politicians who, unlike Biondini, were smart enough not to leave a trail of glow-in-the-dark swastika-shaped breadcrumbs to follow. Like the French National Rally or the Brothers of Italy, who've both led successful rebranding campaigns to become mainstream, acceptable parties by growing numbers of voters, despite direct, documented, undisputed historical ties to Nazis and fascists. Sometimes you need to be able to call a spade, or an SS symbol an SS symbol when it's prominently displayed in the background of a Brothers of Italy politician's Zoom call. Here's a recent, interesting example of the media missing an opportunity to not be neutral. Conspiracy theorist and current presidential candidate in the Democratic primary, Robert F. Kennedy, recently tweeted this complaining about his lack of Secret Service protection. He said typical turnaround time for protection requests from presidential candidates is 14 days. After 88 days of no response, the Biden administration just denied our requests. Not only are these claims false, non-incumbent candidates don't get Secret Service protection until 120 days before an election, which is still a year off, but the time frame he cites are definitely made up to make a reference to 1488, a number that seems innocuous to the non-initiated but has a lot of significance to neo-Nazis. I don't know about you, but I would call that concerning. Now, I'm not saying RFK himself is a neo-Nazi, but there's 3 possibilities here. Someone set him up, giving him false information, which he tweeted or X'd without knowing what the numbers meant. This is what he claimed happened. Or he's just trolling for the lulz. Or it's what's called a dog whistle. He's giving neo-Nazis a wink and a nod for support. Which isn't too surprising since conspiracy circles, of which RFK is a part, and the far right have a lot of overlap. I mean, Nazism is a conspiracy theory after all. But mainstream media companies completely ignored this story. Maybe because they don't want to give RFK more attention than he deserves, but I think it's also because it's really hard to report on dog whistles while seeming neutral. It's a job that's much better done by people who aren't that concerned about neutrality, like anti-disinfo activist Jim Stewartson, who I saw the story from. And this is also why some of the best journalism around these days is done by comedians. They don't care about their neutrality. Their perspective is a key part of the point they're trying to make, and they bring a lot of receipts to back that point up. Obviously, I'm referring to people like Jon Stewart or John Oliver, but YouTuber Friendly Jordies is doing incredible investigative journalism at the risk of his own life. And if you just watch YouTube channel Some More News' piece on Jordan Peterson and Peter Thiel, you can't tell me that's not valuable journalism. I'm not saying bias towards neutrality is necessarily worse than having a political perspective. It's a different approach. It's better suited for some issues and it's less well suited for others, but it plays a key role in a diverse media landscape. For example, a neutral interviewer will have an easier time getting access to divisive figures than an openly hostile one.
If we don't have neutral journalists, most politicians will only ever talk to friendly interviewers and get asked softball questions. And same goes with access to extremist spaces or war zones. Maintaining a neutral stance can be a question of life or death in those cases. And if the people you're reporting on find out you or your media company have been critical of them in the past, that could put you at serious risk. But at the end of the day, to paraphrase a quote attributed to journalism professor Jonathan Foster at the University of Sheffield, if someone says it's raining and another says it's dry, it's not your job to quote them both. Your job is to look out the fucking window.
It's definitely raining.
You might say that's the difference between neutrality and objectivity. Neutrality is being a stenographer for both sides, and objectivity is siding with the truth no matter whose side it's on. But when you put it that way, what you're essentially asking is for the media to be right all the time, which would be great, but it's obviously unrealistic. Everyone tries to get the facts right. Well, okay, I wish that were true. Anyway, being right all the time, even if you're trying to, is hard. It's so much easier to just standardize the practice of not taking a position on anything. So you can always claim the factual high ground from all the way up there at the peak of Mount Neutrality.
And if I'm pointing at the rain and I tell you, it kind of sucks that it's raining, you can disagree with me on that. Maybe you like the rain, but it's raining nonetheless.
There's a reason why being neutral is correlated with reliability on these kinds of charts. If you quote both sides, you're technically correct. They did both say those things you quoted them as saying. You have all your factual bases covered, so you don't need to take a stand. This isn't to say they don't deserve credit for the reporting they do. What they do is really valuable for plenty of reasons, including just the record of history. But this idea that they're above other journalists is ridiculous. They're not enough on their own. So the solution isn't for journalism to be more neutral or for the media to be perfect, although yes, there is plenty of room for improvement in the media. But news consumers need a better understanding of how the sausage is made and what decisions went into making it. In other words, media literacy is as important as the quality of the journalism itself, although they're both necessary.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that what people usually call unbiased is the kind of journalism that, yes, makes an effort to honestly describe contrasting viewpoints, but, and perhaps more importantly, explains issues in a way that isn't too challenging to the reader's own biases. In other words, bias is in the eye of the beholder. Something might seem fair and balanced to one person and seem incredibly biased to someone else. In reality, it's biased either way, and if you're reporting on a divisive issue and you're not being called out by at least one side for being biased, you're probably being too neutral. You're biased towards the status quo and towards being as inoffensive to everyone as possible. And there are other approaches to journalism that acknowledge that journalists aren't these disembodied neutral observers, but are people with skin in the game and a whole lot of experience covering these issues, which gives their opinion, biased as it may be, at least some validity. One name for that approach is advocacy journalism.
I used to think advocacy journalism was focusing on one issue and being an activist for a specific outcome, but no, it's much broader than that. It's everything I've been talking about. It's acknowledging that you can't be unbiased, that's just not a thing, and doing your best as a human being to do journalism that matters while being open about your perspective. Throughout modern history, the most important journalism had a perspective. It was against the Vietnam War, it was against the Nixon administration, it was against the war on drugs, against the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, against the financial practices that led to the 2008 crisis. And we need journalism like that today at a time when corporations are fueling climate change that no government in the world is doing enough to stop, at a time when the gap between the rich and the poor continues to get wider, and some of the same politicians who are helping that happen acknowledge that it's leading us to civil war, at a time when democracy is losing ground all over the world and the far right is on the rise. Look, the whole democracy dies in darkness thing, I know it sounds super pretentious. It's what smug media elites like to repeat from their high horse, but it's kind of true. Democracy can't exist without a free press, neither can a free press exist without democracy. So journalists have skin in the game, they have to be advocates for democracy. Otherwise, once we lose it, all we'll have will be neutral stenographers just repeating talking points fed to them by those in power. And Chomsky would argue that's already the case. That's why it's literally our job to be critical of those in power. Ideally, to push them to keep on making things better, but oftentimes to try to prevent them from getting worse. And on a side note, I think a large part of the distrust we're seeing in the media today is, on one hand, yes, because the media is highly imperfect, but also because we are critical. It's not our job to praise politicians, and I can understand that when we criticize a politician you like, it can turn you against us, and that's just part of the game. As a writer for the Chicago Evening Post called Finley Peter Dunne famously said back in the 1800s, the job of the newspaper is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable.
And that's my 2 cents.
I had so much more I wanted to talk about, but I'll have to keep those ideas for later, otherwise this video is never gonna go out. I want to be clear that this channel is not intended to be a commentary channel. I might make more videos like this in the future, but it's not gonna be my regular content because I don't want to just look at the news and tell you what I think. I want to follow the facts where they lead. But I can't explain the facts without putting them in context through a lens of analysis, and any lens of analysis, by definition, is gonna be biased. So I guess I'll conclude by acknowledging some of the biases that I have that will definitely influence my work on this channel. I don't think I need to go any more in depth on why I'm biased in favor of freedom of the press, democracy, and against authoritarianism. I am biased against fascism, and I'm not going to apologize for that. And that does need to be said because it really concerns me when I see people who I know not to be fascist repeating fascist and Nazi talking points, like talking about Great Replacement theory or cultural Marxism without understanding the context behind it. If you've read anything about fascism, you know it is way more common in our politics than we like to admit, even today, because it appeals to our basest instincts. It's always there under the surface, and we need to talk about it. And it's getting worse today because some people think it's unfair or biased to call it out. I'm also biased towards choosing to cover stories that worry me because I feel that those are the stories that matter most. But I don't want this to be a doomer channel, so to put a positive spin on it, I'm choosing to cover these stories so we can do something about it and make things better. I'm biased towards equality and human rights, and you might say, well, obviously everyone is, like, you don't even need to say that, but that's the lens through which I look at things like migration and the treatment of refugees, or LGBTQ rights, or systemic inequities. And finally, I'm biased in favor of trying new ways of solving these issues, rather than just doing the things we've always done because the people in power say, things are fine now, don't rock the boat. But even though you might have guessed all of this makes me more friendly towards the left than the right, if their solutions cause more problems than they solve, I won't shy away from pointing that out. One, because it's my job, and two, because I'm not in anyone's pocket. The topic of this video is definitely a divisive issue. If you're a journalist, you probably disagree with a lot of things that I've said, and if you're not a journalist, I'm sure you have some thoughts too, so let's dish it out in the comments. I could go on this topic all day. If I didn't stop myself now, this video would be 5 hours long. If you know people who like to talk about these issues, or people who you think could benefit from hearing this perspective, send them this video. And if you understand my point of view, even if you don't agree 100%, but you want to support my work, please subscribe to my Patreon. It's at patreon.com/barelyinformed. And of course, subscribe to the channel, and you can also find me on Instagram and TikTok at barelyinfo. And finally, I don't want to make it seem like I think I found the perfect balance from the get-go on this issue. There is no one right answer, and I'll definitely be experimenting as I go along. But I'm really excited about the way some creators are experimenting, and I would love to talk to some of them about their process and how they've arrived at it and what challenges they're still dealing with. And if you want to see conversations like that happen, again, support the channel. But for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the comments.